Okay, I think we're ready to go. First off, thank you for joining us this evening for today's webinar, learning about West Virginia's frogs and toad calls. Today's webinar is being presented by the Girl Scouts of Black Diamond and the West Virginia Department of Environmental Protection's Project WET program. So today we'll learn a little bit about what my career path is and how I'm here talking to you today about these animals. We'll go over some general information about frogs and toads and dive into what their differences are. Why do people call them frogs or toads? We'll look at some population trends, and we will actually hear each animal call too. And they have a very unique call, so maybe that's something that you can spread with your friends. They have some problems that they have encountered, and we have some solutions to help them tackle those problems. There's also some ways that you can invite these animals into your backyard, and there's some extra resources and even a little homework if that's something that you're interested in. And once we get to the very end, I will answer any questions that you've entered into the question and answer box. So to tell you a little bit about myself, my name is Tomi Bergstrom, and I work for DEP now, but I used to live in Canaan Valley, which is a very remote place in West Virginia. Maybe a few of you all know of it. There's a beautiful wetland out there in Canaan Valley. So I was exposed to wetlands very early on. I went to Marshall University and studied biology. And after I graduated, I had a class from a guy named Dr. Thomas Pauly. And he said, maybe you should come and join our grad program. So I pursued a master's degree at Marshall, studying herpetology, and herpetology is the study of reptiles and amphibians. So this is me down here in the bottom picture out in the field. So we spent a lot of evenings with headlamps on out in the swamp. And what I did is I studied the different calls that these animals make. And each animal has a different wave pattern that they produce, just like when we talk or when you're making music. So I was able to distinguish which animals were making these patterns, and then I could figure out where these animals were located at and how many there were. So now I work with the West Virginia Department of Environmental Protection, and I work with the public on many different watershed projects. I'm out in streams a lot. Sometimes I do cleanups, and I think maybe you all do some cleanups too. I work out in wetlands. I work with the public a lot, doing educational outreach events, and all of this is focused around water. So today we're going to learn a little bit of general information about frogs and toads. So as you know, they are indeed an animal, and they have a vertebrae, which means they have a backbone just like we do. But within the vertebrae, there's several different types of animal classes. There's reptiles, birds, fish, mammals, and amphibians. So frogs and toads are all listed under amphibians. And toads are actually a type of frog. So what makes these animals an amphibian? Well, number one, they have a double life, meaning they hatch from an egg, turn into a tadpole, and are completely dependent on water. They have to be in water to survive. And then they change into an adult where they can get out of water. So that's why they have a double life. They have vertebrates, which means they have a backbone, and they also breathe through their skin and their lungs. And unlike us, they're cold-blooded, meaning they cannot self-regulate their temperatures like we can. If it's cold outside, they're cold. If it's really hot outside, then they're hot. And one thing that's very unique to this type of amphibian compared to salamanders is that frogs and toads can vocalize. This is a very unique thing that they can do. So where do these animals live at? Well, most of the time we will find them in wetland marshes and wetland swamps. That's probably their favorite place. That is their natural habitat. But it's not uncommon to find them along ditches, along roadways. They also like ponds, and maybe you've seen some hop in at ponds before. They also like vernal pools and puddles. So if we look down here at the bottom, you see that this is a typical wetland, and as you move away from the water, you get into more plants, then you get into trees. We'll find a lot of animals right here on the edge of the water where there's a lot of plants, and that's because they can hide in those plants. And then toads, as they get older, they actually move further away from this water source out into the forest. So let's cover some interesting facts about frogs and toads. Number one, frogs and toads are the only amphibian without a tail. So we actually collectively call them anurans. So if you want to reference the whole group of them, you can just call them anurans. That means they are tailless. Baby frogs are called tadpoles. Maybe you knew that one. These animals have transparent inner eyelids. And that means whenever they dive down into the water, they're still able to see because they can see through their eyelid, but they need to protect their eye. They also have webbed feet, and that makes them to be excellent swimmers. They need their eyes to swallow food, which is a little weird for us to think about. Imagine every time that you swallowed, if you had to shut your eyes because your eyes shutting is what pushes the food down your throat. That's how it is for frogs and toads. Frogs have been on the earth since dinosaurs were around, so they're very old. They have been here on planet Earth a very long time. And they are found on every continent on planet Earth except for Antarctica. And a really cool thing about these animals, if you've ever held one and had it jump out of your hand, you might have noticed that they can jump about 20 times the length of their body. That's pretty far. So what do these animals eat anyways? All kinds of stuff. So let's dive into this a little bit. If you kiss a frog, is it going to turn into a prince? Nope, don't try it. If you pick up a toad, are you going to get warts all over your hands? Nope, they're okay to pick up, but they might pee on you because you scared them. And that's a defense mechanism. So, what are the differences between frogs and toads? I told you earlier that toads are a type of frog, but a lot of people call them one or the other because they're so different. So frogs usually live near water their whole lives, not just as tadpoles. So you will find them around swamps, seeps, or ponds. They have smooth, slimy skin, and they're quite fast. Toads, on the other hand, are not known to live next to water. You're more likely to find them in a yard, in a meadow, or out in the forest. They have very dry, bumpy skin with little warts all over it. And they are very, very slow hoppers. So if you've caught one of these animals before, you're more likely to be able to pick up a toad because they're like little bulldogs and they will just sit there and let you pick them up. Of course, like I said earlier, they might pee on you. So let's look at their egg masses. So whenever they have eggs, they look quite different too. So let's just compare two different species, wood frogs compared to the American toad. So these animals engage in something called amplexus. So if you ever see two of them attached like this, they are engaging in amplexus so that they can have fertilized eggs. Their eggs look really different. Wood frogs, when they lay their eggs, they're in clumps like this, and they lay about 400 to 1,000 eggs. That's a lot. But American toads, they will lay eggs in long ribbons, as you see on the right-hand side. And those are from about 4,000 to 8,000 eggs. So they have way, way, way more babies. The wood frogs have clumps of eggs that are attached to vegetation. And I'm sure that you've probably seen these out in a pond at some point. There's usually tons of clumps all together. The American toad, on the other hand, they have them in a long string. So if you look at the American toad eggs, you can see that there's a partition between each egg. You can see each individual egg. So they will hatch in about 3 weeks, the wood frogs will. And then in about another 2 to 4 months, they will transform into a frog. And when I say a frog, I mean a wee little tiny frog, as you can see here on the left-hand side. The American toad will hatch in a few days, so much quicker. And they have way more eggs too, right? And they will transform into a toad in about 1 to 2 months. And again, these are wee little tiny toads, not the full-grown version yet. Okay, it's time for a recap poll. So let me pull that up for you. Here we go. All right, so there is a poll that is shared on your screen right now, and it has 2 questions. Frogs and toads are vertebrates, meaning they have a backbone. Which animal class do they fall under? So you can go ahead and select your answer now. The second question is, what do frogs and toads eat? And there's 3 different answers there for you to select from, and this one is a multiple choice. Okay, I'll share the results with you here. So which animal class do they fall under? Nice job, amphibian, that's right. What do frogs and toads eat? And they do eat worms, moths, and flies. So all 3 of these is the correct answer. So where are these animals at? We know they're in West Virginia, but where are they at on the whole planet? So they're on every continent except for Antarctica. And if you notice, down here where the equator is in South America, it's very warm there and it's very humid. So there's a lot of water in the air. And that's where we find the highest densities of these animals on planet Earth. And that's why the rainforest in that area is so important, because it houses so many of our amphibians. Now you might notice up here in the United States on the eastern side, where it stays a little bit more humid too, we have a lot of these animals as well. So we have 14 total species in West Virginia, and they range quite a bit, about 1.5 inches up to 7 inches. So the size difference is pretty big. And we do have animals in every single county, but not every single animal is found in every county. Some of them are only in certain locations in West Virginia. So when we talk about vocalizations, only the males can call, not the females. The males call so that they can breed and they can attract the females and let them know where they're at. And they might also do that to defend their territory. The males have a thing called a vocal sac, which you can see is inflated here on this spring peeper. So it's located right underneath their chins. They will call only seasonally when the temperature starts to warm up, and usually when it starts to rain a lot, which is in the springtime, so right now. So if you look at the bottom picture, I just want to point out the size differences for these animals, and this is pretty consistent across the board. Usually the female is a much larger animal than the male, and that's because she's full of hundreds, if not thousands, of eggs. So that's why she's much larger. So we're going to go ahead and start learning about these different animals we have in West Virginia, and you can hear each one of their calls. So the first one we have here is the eastern spadefoot toad. This toad is one of 3 different toads that we have in West Virginia. It's called a spadefoot because it actually has a little tool on its hind legs that looks like a spade. So it can burrow back into sand or into dirt very easily. Their call is very unique and it sounds kind of like a sheep or a goat. Take a listen. Okay, so if you ever hear that when you're outside, remember that is an eastern spadefoot toad. The second toad I'm going to tell you about that we have in West Virginia is our most common toad, the eastern American toad. And it has a call that sounds like a long trill or a cricket. A lot of people will actually confuse it with crickets. I know this is an American toad because if I look at the black spots on its back, it has 1 or 2 warts per black spot. That is a pretty quick way to identify American toads, although there are other ways as well. So let's listen to their call. I bet it's something you've heard before. So these animals, just so you know, they're about 4 inches long. They're not real big, but about the size of your fist. So they're pretty good sized animals. The third toad I'm going to tell you about is the Fowler's toad. And this animal is spotted across West Virginia. It has a call that sounds similar, but a little bit different. So let's see if you can tell the difference. Oh, and one other thing. If you look at its black spots on its back, you'll notice that it has 3 or 4 warts per black spot. So that's one way we can tell these animals apart. So their calls are pretty different, even though all 3 of those animals are toads. So let's get into the little tiny guys. These are northern spring peepers, and I bet you've heard of spring peepers before. Most people have. One thing that people might not realize about spring peepers is that they are about the size of a quarter. So they're very tiny animals, and that's why it can be very difficult to locate them. That, and they're very fast. Spring peepers have this X across their back, and that is one indication. One way that we can identify these animals is by that X on their back. They have a peep that I'm sure you will recognize. So these animals are so tiny, but when you get a lot of them together and they're all peeping at the same time, it can be deafening. Another small frog that we have in West Virginia is called the mountain chorus frog. This is a very common animal as well. It's found in every county, just like the spring peeper. If you notice, it does not have that X across its back. Otherwise, it looks very similar, but their calls are significantly different. When you're driving, you might hear this animal start to call in the evening as the sun sets. They like to hang out in ditches, so when you're driving along the road, you're likely to hear them. Has anybody heard that before? Another chorus frog that we have is the upland chorus frog. This animal is only found in the eastern part of our state. So once you get west of the Allegheny Mountains, we don't have it. This animal sounds very similar to the last one, but it has some differences. Check it out. Hopefully you could tell the difference there. This is one of my favorite frogs that we have in West Virginia, and you've probably heard or seen them before. They're called gray tree frogs. They have a very high-pitched trill, and if you ever get the opportunity to see one, they might be stuck on the side of your house picking off little bugs that are flying around your lights at night. They have little specialized toe discs on each of their fingers, and this allows them to be able to grip and stick onto things like trees. Let's listen to their call. I'm sure you've heard that one before too. Now on to the big boy. This is the American bullfrog. The bullfrog will eat anything it can fit inside of its mouth, including little baby bullfrogs. So it is not a picky eater. And maybe that's why it's one of the largest animals that we have. Well, it is the largest frog that we have in West Virginia. And very fittingly, it has a call that sounds a little bit like a cow mooing. Another animal that is similar looking to a bullfrog, which, by the way, I meant to tell you, bullfrog tadpoles can take up to 2 years to transform into a full bullfrog, so much longer. The northern green frog is very similar looking, but they're much smaller and they happen to be really green. Their calls are completely different, and you have probably seen these at any pond you've ever been at in West Virginia. They're very common. Their sound is something similar to a banjo string being plucked. I'm sure you've heard that one at some point. Now we have a couple animals that are not as common. One of them is the northern leopard frog. And of course, this is named the northern leopard frog because it has spots on it. Kind of looks like a leopard. Their call is very different than anything you've heard so far. It's kind of like a snoring sound with some grunts at the end. This animal is found in certain locations in West Virginia, but it's definitely not in every county. West Virginia DNR does have it as a rating of a species of concern. So here's what it sounds like. A little creepy if you're out in a wetland by yourself at night. One animal that people get the leopard frog confused with all the time is the pickerel frog. Now the pickerel frog does have similar pattern, but they're a little bit more square shaped. Also on its belly down here at the bottom, you might see that has a gold color. So that gold color is something different that leopard frogs do not have. Their calls are pretty similar too. And one kind of strange fact about the pickerel frog is that they smell pretty bad. And a lot of animals don't eat them just because of that. So if you ever get the chance to see a pickerel frog, take a whiff of it, I guess. Here's what they sound like. So they have that snoring sound, but not the grunts at the end. One of my favorite animals that we have in West Virginia is the wood frog. And although most people think that the spring peeper is the first frog that emerges in the spring, it's actually the wood frog. The wood frog is not scared of cold temperatures. They will lay their eggs when there's still ice on ponds. And not surprisingly, they're the only frog that is found in Alaska. So the wood frog is both in West Virginia and Alaska. That's pretty neat. They have this very distinctive black band that goes from their eye back towards their ear. And their call sounds a lot like a quack. So a lot of people confuse them with ducks, actually. I think this is the last animal I'm telling you about today, and this is the eastern cricket frog. This animal is only located in one part of our state, and that is in the eastern panhandle. It's not found west of Allegheny Mountains. Its sound is very different from any of the other animals you've heard so far today. Let's give it a listen. Okay, it's time for our call wrap-up poll. So I'm going to go ahead and launch our final poll for you. This poll has 3 different questions, so please read through them and go ahead and complete it. The first question is, both male and female frogs can vocalize or call. Is that true or false? What is the only frog that lives in Alaska and West Virginia? Is it the spring peeper, the bullfrog, the wood frog, or the mountain chorus frog? Where do frogs and toads usually call from? You might have noticed in the videos that you're watching, they all call from a very similar place. So let's just recap. Both male and female frogs can vocalize or call. That is false. Only the males can. They're the only ones that have a vocal sac. What is the only frog that lives in Alaska and West Virginia? That is, of course, our masked bandit, the wood frog. Where do frogs and toads usually call from? And yes, they usually call from water. And that's why wetlands are so important to these animals. So let's look at some of those problems and solutions that frogs and toads are encountering. One thing is a lot of their habitat, so wetlands, for example, are being destructed, meaning maybe they're getting filled in with soil so that we can build shopping plazas on top of them. Maybe trees are being cut, and what that does is it dries out the soil so the water won't stay in these little pools as long anymore. Also, you might have noticed that the ditches that go along our roads, well, they're right along roads. And what do roads have on them? Cars. So whenever these animals go to get into the ditch so that they can call and they can breed and lay their eggs, they take a chance of getting ran over by vehicles. So this time of the year in particular, in the spring, especially when we have heavy rains, if you're out driving, please keep your eyes peeled for animals that are crossing the road. We will have salamanders doing the same thing right around now too. Water pollution is also something that is starting to threaten our frogs pretty bad. There's a lot of chemicals that can get into our water. That's why we have to treat our water before we can drink it. So if you look at this picture, we're starting to see some deformities with some animals if they are exposed to a pesticide. Pesticides are used often in large agriculture scale farms. So they're used to make sure that insects don't eat our plants that we need to live. Whenever it rains, that can wash into these little ponds, or it can wash into areas that these frogs might be at. And sometimes they can have deformities as a result of that. Of course, you might think having 3 legs is better than 2, but it's not. Another thing is our warming climate. So as everything gets warmer, we start to see more droughts. We also start to see heavier rainstorms in certain places where maybe it doesn't normally rain like that, and big flooding events. These droughts or these major flooding events, they can disrupt the cycle that's very important to these animals in the springtime. So if we have a really dry spring or we have a really warm spring, that water might dry up before the animals are able to hatch out of the egg and turn into a tadpole, and then again into a toad or a frog. There's also different diseases and funguses that are being spread, and humans are pretty guilty of spreading these around. We go all around the world, and these animals are exposed to whatever we expose them to. So for example, fish hatcheries, whenever we do a stocking with fish to different rivers, different ponds, different lakes, we take that water that was from the fish hatchery and we put it into that fresh body of water. If that fungus is floating around in that water from the fish hatchery, now these animals can be exposed to it. And there's quite a few frogs dying off because of a fungus called chytrid that gets on them, and it pretty much keeps them from completing their life cycle. One other thing I'll just talk about real quickly is an invasive, different types of invasive species being introduced. So as we travel around and as we have animals that are pets, sometimes people think if you have an animal that is a reptile or an amphibian, it's okay to let them loose into the wild. And that's actually not correct. If you do have a pet turtle or a pet snake or a pet frog, you need to keep that animal for the whole extent of its life. Once they have been in captivity, they can get different bacteria or funguses on them that if they are exposed to animals outside, it could kill them off. Also, with the pet trade, sometimes animals are pulled out of their natural habitat and put into a box and sold to people at pet stores. That doesn't happen as much in the United States, but it certainly does in other countries. So just be conscious if you're going to a pet store to pick up an animal, make sure that it is something that wasn't pulled straight out of the wild. And make sure that you care for that animal too. So why are these animals so important? Well, number one, they are one of the most diverse and the most widespread of all amphibians. We have a toad up here at the top that is found in South America, and we have a frog at the bottom that's also found in South America. Very, very different creatures, both of them anurans, of course. These animals are bioindicators, which is a big sciencey term that we use. But basically, if you were going to go fishing and you saw a bunch of dead frogs in the pond that you're fishing at, are you going to eat a fish that you get from there? Probably not. These animals are very sensitive to water pollution. So if we see that they have been killed off for some reason, we know that there must be some problem with that water. So that's why we call them a bioindicator. They're kind of like a red flag that something is going on. And as we noticed earlier, these animals eat lots and lots of different types of different bugs and insects, rodents, even birds. So they're a very important part to the food chain. Imagine if we didn't have frogs and toads and we had all those extra insects flying around. They can eat their weight in bugs every day. And not surprising, lots of other animals eat them. That's why toads, for example, will lay so many eggs, is because they know some of their young are going to get picked off before they make it into mature adult. So they are a very important part to the food chain. So let me tell you a few different ways that you can attract these animals to your backyard. One thing is that you can build a toad house. And that's what this little girl has done here at the bottom. You can take a ceramic pot or a terracotta pot, and if you just crack it in half, it makes like a little hut. So you can see here, sometimes animals, they will just find their ways into these. They are out in your yard, maybe you just don't see them, but if you make them a habitat that they like, they will come to it. You can also paint these pots and put them out, so that might be a fun activity for you to do right now. If you do garden or if you do have plants outside, if you don't use pesticides, that's another way that you can make it a safe zone for these animals to come into your backyard. You can also start composting, or you can create a pond. And the pond doesn't have to be as fancy as it is here on the right-hand side. My mother had a pond that she just stuck down into the ground, and every year since then, we've had wood frog eggs and spotted salamander eggs in it. So they have a knack for finding these water sources, especially in the spring when it's breeding time. And of course, if you can't do any of these other things, you can always plant a tree. So if you would still like to learn more about some things we talked about today, there's some resources here for you. And all of these are just websites that you can access. So one of them is you can learn about different wetland plants that we have in West Virginia and explore those. You can visit Marshall's website, our herpetology class's website, and learn a little bit more about all of these animals and exactly where they're located. And if you are an amphibian lover and you'd like to learn more about salamanders, there is a free PDF download that shows you all the different salamanders that we have in the state of West Virginia. The same goes for snakes. So you can download those brochures off of DNR's website. So I hope after learning a little bit more about these animals today, that you agree with me and you think that they're pretty cool. If you get the opportunity, talk to your family, talk to your friends virtually if you can, about what was your favorite thing about today? What did you learn about them that maybe you didn't know? So help spread the word about how important these animals are. And if you're interested, there's some follow-up homework. So 3 different things that I could suggest to you, and these are all from our Wow, the Wonders of Wetland guidebook. One is that you can take a walk outside and you can look for signs of wildlife. You might not see wildlife right there in front of you, but you might see a nest, or you might see a track or some animal scat. You might be able to tell just from these simple clues that they left behind what was there. And you can always record your findings, so you can have a little log that you keep every day and go out and check things. Another thing is that you can research animals that can be found in a wetland, just like frogs are. You can draw the animals out or write out their names. Figure out if they spend their whole life there, like the green frog does, or just a portion, like the American toad does. From that list, you could research adaptations that plants and animals have made to live in or near wetlands. For example, frogs have webbed feet and they can breathe through their skin and their lungs. So from your animal list, pick one and discover what adaptations it has. A really cool one to check out is the American beaver. It has really, really neat adaptations. Up here we have a turtle. This is a painted turtle. And over here we have a blue heron. All 3 of these animals are really cool wetland animals with unique adaptations that you could learn more about. So We're all finished with the presentation now. Thanks for completing with the polls. If you have any questions, this is my email. I will be sharing this slide with, or this whole presentation with the Girl Scouts so they can share that out to you all. This is our DEP's website and also our Facebook page. So if you want to keep up on what we're doing at DEP, you can follow us online. So at this point, I'm going to pull up questions and see what we have here. It looks like we have a lot. All right, so we'll start at the top. Do I have a favorite frog? Ooh, I think the wood frog is probably my favorite, but I also like the green frog because of their banjo call. And I love the gray tree frog because it's a tree frog. So I guess they're all my favorite. How long did I go to school to study herpetology? So I completed my master's in 2 years at Marshall University, and I studied herpetology. I got my first taste of that in undergrad studying biology at Marshall. If you ever get the chance to go to college and take a herpetology class, I really encourage you to do it. It teaches you a lot about the natural world. What animals eat toads and frogs? So blue herons will eat them. Many different insects like diving beetles will eat the eggs when they're young. Newts, maybe you've seen a spotted newt before, they're really common. They will also eat the eggs and the tadpoles. Raccoons will eat them as well. Toads actually have a cool thing on their back called parotoid glands, and these glands contain a poison in them. So if you ever see a toad that has been eaten, it probably was flipped on its back because that's where its poison glands are located at, and they would just eat its belly. Snakes, many different snakes will eat frogs and toads too. There's actually one snake called the hognose snake that is specialized to eat toads. Another thing toads might do whenever you pick them up is they will inflate full of air to make themselves look bigger. And the hognose snake has 2 little puncture things in the back of its throat. So whenever it goes to bite it, it punctures those air sacs and is able to swallow it easier. So we learned about all the frogs in West Virginia today, and we covered what a wetland is. I pursued this career because I love being outside, and I grew up on a farm. I grew up watching these animals, and I had a professor that turned me on to checking it out. So that's how I ended up there. Okay, I think the question is, what is a vertebrae? So a vertebrae just means that it has a backbone. So we have a backbone as well. Where did I find the video that showed what frogs eat? I believe that is a BB&C video. So you can just go to YouTube. All these videos were found from YouTube. Are frogs and toads enemies? They are not. It's very common to see both of them in the same pond. They do not attack each other. Though the one thing that's the most aggressive is a bullfrog. So if you see a bullfrog around, you might consider him an enemy because he'll eat any of them. Again, not a picky eater. So we discussed a little bit about how you can attract frogs, and the best way to do that is just to have a water source available in your backyard. So if you have a small pond, you will most likely get frogs in it eventually, unless you live smack dab in the middle of a big city. So why do American toads lay their eggs in 2 lines? I don't know why they do that. Every animal, I'm sure, has a reason why it adapted to lay its eggs in a certain formation or in a certain way. And all toads lay their eggs in ribbons like that. So are there any frogs in West Virginia that are poisonous? That's a question I always get. None of them are poisonous to us, but like I mentioned earlier, toads have those parotoid glands on the back, and they do carry something called a bufotoxin. So if you have a dog and you see a toad, do not let your dog try to eat the toad because it will make it start to foam at the mouth. Probably not kill it unless it's really tiny, but keep your animals away from toads. Now, you can pick up a toad. I can pick it up and handle it without gloves on, and I don't get that toxin on me. It's only if you would ingest it. But that's the closest thing that we have. So in West Virginia, we have 14 species total of frogs and toads. And worldwide, I do not know the number of how many we have, but we have a lot. Certain toads are poisonous and certain frogs are poisonous. Do cricket frogs eat crickets? My guess would be, yeah, probably the little tiny ones, because cricket frogs are very small little animals. Are there any of these frogs or toads that are in Minnesota? I'm sure many of these animals are also found in Minnesota. I do not know exactly which ones though. Going down here, okay. What does the eastern spadefoot toad eat? This animal eats very similar things to the other ones. So it might eat slugs or flies, spiders, worms, that type of thing. Okay, what is the smallest toad? The smallest toad is going to be one that has freshly hatched out. In West Virginia, they're all very similar size, but I do believe the spadefoot is just a little bit smaller. Are any frogs albino? Not that we have in West Virginia, but I know there are some that live in caves that are albino. I do not encourage people actually to have frogs as pets. I think that they do much better out in a natural environment where you can observe them and watch them fulfill their whole life cycle. So if you do have one as a pet, just make sure you're taking really good care of it. What is the smallest frog? In West Virginia, that would probably be one of our chorus frogs, spring peeper, or the cricket frog. All of them are about the same size. So what can we do to protect them? Like I mentioned earlier, basically just don't use pesticides. Try to plant trees and create habitat for them, because a lot of their habitat is being disturbed. So if you have property where you can have a wetland, or maybe there was one there before, and you can flood it again, wetlands do wonders for our environment, and they also provide a lot of almost like a nursery to a lot of animals. Are any of the toads or frogs in West Virginia found in Maryland? Yes, many of them are. Any of our neighboring states probably have very similar animals. However, for West Virginia being as far north as it is, we have way more animals in most states as north as we are. I think PA has pretty similar numbers, but as it gets colder in the wintertime, you start to see less amphibians. That's why Alaska only has one. So my guess is Maryland probably has a few less than us, but probably similar species. I don't know the total population of frogs and toads in the whole world, but that is a great question for Google. So Google it and let us know. Frogs and toads, all of them mate in the spring, and they usually mate whenever it starts to get colder and a little bit darker at night. They can see really, really well at night. So this time of the year, this is their mating season. So you will hear them call. So if you get the opportunity to take a walk when it's just starting to get dark, you might hear some of these animals that we discussed tonight. I've been working with DEP for about 8 years. And before that, I had other jobs that were in line with environmental positions. So I worked with the Mon Forest before that, constructing frog habitat and planting trees and looking at flying squirrels and all kinds of fun stuff. So hope that answers your question. Do I have any pets? I have 7 chickens, 4 cockatiel birds that are 20 plus years old. I have 3 cats, 1 dog, a betta fish, and a red-eared slider turtle that we found from an abandoned home, actually. My least favorite frog? I think I like all of them. I don't think I have a least favorite frog. There's none that I feel negative towards. Are any of them endangered? The one in West Virginia, our northern leopard frog, that animal is not endangered, but it's close to that. And that is because a lot of its habitat, which was along the Ohio River, has been filled in with soil, and so they don't have those nice big wetlands like we used to along the Ohio River. So I hope that answers your question there. I've been interested in frogs since I was a little kid. I used to watch them turn into tadpoles and all that. I think they're really interesting animals. Toads and frogs cannot get married in real life, but probably in books they do. Is it okay to get tadpoles from a pet store and raise them and release them into local ponds? No, that's not really an okay thing to do. That kind of goes back to if you have an animal in captivity, it should stay in captivity. They can, especially if they're from a pet store, who knows exactly where they came from. They could have a fungus or a bacteria on them that you could potentially infect into a natural area. So if you have those animals, you want to try to keep them in captivity the whole time, unfortunately. And so hopefully that answers your question there. How long is their lifespan? In captivity, it's been noted that they can live up to 20 years, depending on the species. Some of them are a little bit less than that. A lot of times their lifespan is determined by what predator they encounter as they go through life. How many species of frogs and toads are there? I'm not actually sure. That's another good question for Google. There's so many in South America, I can't even begin to tell you about all of them. So how do the frogs swim? You might have noticed that they have webbed feet. So just like we might stick webbing on our feet to be able to swim better, they do that same thing, and they're excellent swimmers, and they can also put their eyes down whenever they dive in, making them even more aerodynamic as they dive into that water very quickly. So they're excellent swimmers. My favorite toad is the American toad, and that's actually the animal that I focused my thesis on, and that's why I talk about toads so much, as you've probably noticed. Should you catch frogs or not? So a couple of things on that. If you're catching frogs, you want to make sure that your hands are washed. You don't want to have lotion on them. And if you get the opportunity, stick your hands into some water that is out there in the natural environment so that your hands will not be dry. The animals breathe through their skin. So if you hold them out of water and your hands are dry, it can actually dry them out too. It's okay to catch them. It's okay to observe them. What you shouldn't do is take them home with you. Check them out and then let them go back where you got them from. If you do collect an animal, which you're not supposed to, DNR will get on you for that. If you do collect an animal, you need to make sure you put it right back where it came from. And to follow up on that a little bit more, as soon as I see a frog or toad, the first thing I want to do is pick it up. And I usually do pick it up and I check it out and maybe I take a picture of it and then I let it back go where I got it from. So where do frogs go when their ditch or pond dries up? Ponds usually don't dry up, so but if it does, then they would go to another body of water and there finds more water. And this is some of the issues I was talking about with their habitat being destructed, is that the areas are drying up. How do you make a pond? Another great question for Google. I do these talks at summer camps usually to an assembly, but we're doing them virtual now. I don't know how long you can keep a toad in a jar or a cage. If you do have one, you want to research the exact habitat requirements for that animal to make sure it lives a long, healthy life. They need a big area to live in. They're used to being outside and traveling many miles. Do all frogs have long tongues to catch flies? Yes, all of them have pretty long tongues, especially compared to our tongues, which are really short. So they are kind of sticky and they can go out and latch that animal. How can we help if we live in the city? You can help encourage natural areas. So if you get to vote, if a park comes in or something like that, those areas are protected and they're great, great for the wildlife in general. So you still have a voice, even if you don't have your own property that can support these animals. And you can do your part to share information about pesticides and how it can impact the animals. Do I know any herpetologists that live in Kansas? I do not. I do know several herpetologists, but none that live in Kansas. Ooh, we have a lot more questions. I'm going to do just a few more questions and then sign off on here. How many frogs have I caught in one day? I used to measure lots and lots of toads for my thesis, but I would just pick them up for a moment, measure them, and then put them back down. I don't know how many I've caught in a day. Frogs and toads cannot mate. That is not a thing. Okay. The most common frogs and toads, green frogs are incredibly common. American toads are incredibly common, and also spring peepers. So those are the ones that people are most familiar with. How deep can they dive? I think each species is a little bit different. Probably the deepest diver is the green frog, and they can dive, however far down they want. They actually breathe through their skin, so they don't have to come back up to the surface immediately. Where are the frogs during the winter? That's a good question. So these animals hibernate essentially. They burrow back down into leaf matter, or they might burrow into mud. So they go down underground where the temperature change is not as significant, and they winterize there. So in the springtime, they all start to emerge and go find their water sources. Frogs and toads cannot get COVID-19 that I know of. How many babies they can have changes a lot between what species you're looking at. Do frogs lick their eyes? I don't believe so. I think that's something that like geckos and lizards do more so. Can you move eggs to watch them hatch? Yes, you can do that. But again, you want to not be collecting a lot of animals. And if you are going to move them into an area, you want to definitely make sure you know how to take care of them so that you aren't taking them out of their natural environment. If they spend too long with you, then you need to keep them forever. So keep that in mind too. It's better to have an outside setting where you can just go observe them every day or every week and see how they change. Is the golden toad dead? I don't know of a golden toad. There's a golden frog in California that has been heavily impacted from that chytrid fungus. Okay, I think that is all the questions there. Thank you all very much for your participation.